About 7 o'clock, so I'd like to call this meeting to order. Thank you all for coming, and also publicly thank the library for letting us use the Firefly Room tonight. For those of you whom I haven't met, I'm your Congressman, Jim Sensenbrenner. So with any further ado, first up in this part of the meeting.
Recently, the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Devin Nunes, drafted a memo impugning the reputation of the FBI and the Justice Department. Many Republican members of Congress have likewise inferred that the FBI and Justice Department have a vendetta against the president. Fox News is taking a similar position. All of this seems intended to question the fairness and legitimacy of the Mueller investigation. My question: do you support the work of Special Counsel Mueller, and what steps have you taken and your colleagues to prevent him from dismissal?
Well, first of all, I do support Mr. Mueller's investigation. In the last decade, during the 6 years I was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee and he was the FBI director, I had nothing but a professional relationship with him. I think we had mutual respect for each other, and he had a lot of problems with procurement, of virtual case tracking equipment, where there were some of the providers that did not provide what was needed in the contract. We talked about this, asked for my forbearance, and said that he was planning on referring some of these matters to the civil division to have a civil lawsuit to recoup the money that had been paid. So the answer to that question is yes, I support Bob Mueller. Now, I have read the Nunes memo after it was released. There was nothing in the Nunes memo that related to the Mueller investigation. As far as Mr. Mueller's continued work in that position, under the Constitution, that is entirely an executive branch responsibility under the Appointments Clause of the U.S. Constitution. So even if Congress should pass legislation prohibiting his firing, I believe that would be struck down very quickly by a federal court because the president does have plenary power, to make these types of appointments, and if he wants to hire somebody, he can fire somebody. I hope the president does not do that with Mr. Mueller.
So nothing has really been done to protect him in any particular way because you don't think there is anybody that...
I don't think there's anything that constitutionally can be done. And all of us took an oath of office at the beginning of each term to uphold the Constitution, and I cannot, consistent with that oath in good conscience, vote for legislation that I believe is not constitutional. And, there have been recent Supreme Court cases that, attempted to take away the Appointments Clause and prevent the firing of somebody who was appointed by a president, and the federal courts have said that those laws are unconstitutional. So anybody that tries to tell you that Congress has got the constitutional authority to stop Mueller's firing is giving you a bill of goods, because it simply is not.
Polls show that between 80% and 90% of Americans want to see that the Dreamers get rights to citizenship. What I'm asking you is, do you ever think about if your life were not so fortunate, and if there was an earthquake or a disaster or something like the Hondurans and people from El Salvador experienced?
How about being in a train wreck? Because I'm a survivor of that a couple of weeks ago.
That would have been terrible.
Yeah.
That would have been terrible. And I think we're all taught by our parents to put ourselves in other people's shoes, correct?
Yes.
To try and see it from somebody else's eyes. So if I'm in the United States and I'm not a citizen, but I'm here because my parents brought me here, and I had no choice in the matter, or I came because there was, such violence in my country that I, escaped that violence. And I've been here for 10, 20 years, sometimes even 30 years. And in that time, I can't put my life on hold. I can't, not fall in love. I cannot not have children because I'm a person that, wants all the things that anybody else would want. So have you ever put yourself in these people's position And can you say then that you couldn't vote for a vote to give them a path towards citizenship? I mean, what's your real position?
Well, let me say, I believe that the Dreamers should be allowed to stay in the country. And I am a co-sponsor of the Goodlatte bill that does that. However, the President has said quite explicitly that he will not sign a bill that does that without having border security in it and paying for the border security. In order to keep the Dreamers in the country past March 5th and preventing them from being deportable, not that they're all going to be deported instantly or even in the long-term future, this President is going to have to be presented a bill that he will sign. And that's the way it is. And people who come and say, oh, help out the Dreamers but forget about the border security, are basically saying that they're putting their opposition to border security ahead of helping out the Dreamers. I don't want to do that, and I want to see a bill that passes both houses and is signed by the President of the United States that will help out the Dreamers under the conditions that President Trump has said publicly and repeatedly. And whether you like it or not, he is the President of the United States. He has the power to sign or veto legislation, and if you want to help out the Dreamers, you've got to get a bill signed.
But President Trump also said before television cameras that whatever Congress brings to him, he will sign. He said that.
Well, he said that, but
whatever Congress brings to him.
Well, I don't think Congress is going to bring to him anything that does not have border security in it. And after he said anything that Congress sends him, he will sign, he has stated that he will not sign a bill that does not contain the border security that he has called for. And, it is what it is. Now, I guess the question is does anybody really want to risk a veto of legislation, which again will put the Dreamers in a deportable position, simply because Congress does put border security in there. I support border security.
And most people do.
Yes, and most people do. And that's what the President has said that he wants, and I think that most Americans, want that forever. What I can say is back when I was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, our committee passed out a law called the Secure Fence Act that authorized physical obstructions on the border. Whether it was a wall or something else, high-tech stuff, and both Senator Schumer and Representative Pelosi voted in favor, of that law. So, they might have changed their mind, which is the prerogative, of anybody based upon, other circumstances, including the President. But I'm just taking the President's most recent public statements that he will not sign a bill that does not contain border security. So, I guess what I can say is that, people ought to realize that's the case and realize that this is going to go to the White House as a package. And if it doesn't go to the White House as a package, it will be vetoed, and there are not the votes to override a veto in either house.
I can't believe that if Congress got together and worked towards it, that President Trump wouldn't sign it because he said most definitely.
Well, hey, listen, we have been working on immigration reform probably for the last 15 to 20 years on that, and Congress has not been able to get together because you've got people way on one side or people way on the other side, and then you got a bunch of people in the middle that won't vote for anything, no matter what's in there. So there's not been a majority vote in the House of Representatives on that, and that's the case today. Now, I guess what I'm saying to everybody who want to help out the Dreamers, and I do, and that's take a deep breath, and realize that there's going to have to be a compromise, and that is something that I've been saying for over a year at meetings like this. No compromise, no bill. You probably won't get the votes to pass it, and this President has said most recently that if there isn't a compromise with that, the bill gets vetoed.
Would you support Representative Ryan bringing up a bill that has support from both sides and just allowing it to, happen?
Well, the majority party leadership, whether the Republicans or the Democrats are in the majority, decide, what the schedule is. I would say that the Goodlatte bill, which I am a co-sponsor of, that, does keep the dreamers in the country, that has got overwhelming support, amongst the Republican members of the House of Representatives. But, what I can say is that I don't think that shutting down the government, over the dreamers, helped the dreamers out at all. And that happened last month.
Still, Speaker Ryan could allow conflicting or, opposite votes to come up
Well,
and
that's,
see which one wins the most.
that's a decision that he will have to make by himself. And, I don't think he is going to make any decision until we see what, if anything, the Senate passes. And they're starting their debate this week. But in the Senate, you need to have 60 votes. And there are 51 Republican senators, so that means, assuming all the Republican senators vote for something, you're going to have at least 9 Democratic votes. Now, I don't think all the Republican senators are going to vote for something that comes up regardless of what it is. I can't predict who will be the no votes, but it depends upon what they're being asked to vote on.
But I'm also very concerned, and I would guess that a lot of people share my concern about the harsh tactics that ICE is using to deport people in this country. It's not, in my view, what America is all about.
In response,
May I just follow up with
Surely.
one thing? Today, there is a young man sitting in Kenosha detention. His name is Miguel Perez. He is served 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan, and we are going to deport him. Now, really, is that our country?
well, let me say, I'm not familiar with that case, so
I wish you would look into it.
Well,
asking you to get familiar. Yes or no?
May I answer, please?
Yes, of course.
ICE's priorities, are that the top, the people that they take priority in deporting are those that have criminal records on that. And if somebody has a criminal record and is in this country illegally, they ought to be deported because they have abused our hospitality. And to have a criminal record, you've either got to plead guilty or be found guilty by a jury on that. So, I don't think that, people who abuse our hospitality, who break our laws, who end up being put in jail, not because they're in here illegally, but because they have broke our laws, ought to be deported. Now, one of the problems that we have had is that the previous administration had a catch and release policy, even with people with criminal records. So you've seen people who have been deported numerous times that have ended up committing, really horrific crimes, like the person who murdered Kate Steinle in San Francisco.
Was acquitted. He was acquitted.
Yeah, but he had several criminal violations that were on his record before his last illegal entry into the country. And if we started being firm and saying that if you were illegal in this country and have a criminal record, you ought to leave, and you ought to leave quickly.
Sir, may I just follow up with one
Sure.
point? I think everyone in this room agrees that people who belong to gangs and who are criminals, they do need to be deported. But every day, every single day, we hear about people who are being deported, who have committed no offense or have been driving without a license or overstayed their visa, which thousands of people have done. This is not fair. We see them dragged out of their homes by ICE. This is, I can't say it harshly enough, this is not America.
Well, I can say that, unless we deport people who have broken our laws and who don't belong here, and I'm not talking about breaking the laws after their last illegal entry, it was breaking our laws in prior illegal entries, those are not the type of people that we ought to have here. And to mix these people up with honest, law-abiding, working dreamer and DACA kids, I think is a very, very big mistake. We ought to deal with each of these people as an individual based on their record. And if they ought to be deported, they should be deported. And if you mix them all up in one pot, there are a few bad apples that are going to spoil the whole barrel.
But do you honestly say, sir, that a guy who has spent 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan should be deported?
Well, I can't say what else is on his record. You know, if he was convicted of a serious crime, then he ought to go. Yeah.
So over the summer, both houses of Congress, in an overwhelmingly bipartisan manner, passed sanctions against the Russian government
Yes.
for their interference in the 2016 election.
And I voted for that.
I know you voted for it. Everybody but 5 members of Congress, idiots, didn't. I'm on that with you. About in the last month, CIA Director Pompeo, Secretary of State Tillerson, the Manfra at the Department of Homeland Security, I understand she's in charge of cybersecurity, have all said that Wisconsin was a state. The Election Commission actually confirmed that Wisconsin was one of the states attempted to penetrate by Russian cyber
Would you please
agents.
put the sign down? I can't see Mr. Levesque.
Sorry, I'm tall, but I'm not that tall. Anyway, the Wisconsin Election Commission confirmed that our election in Wisconsin was attempted to be penetrated by Russian state agents. And we've heard very recently from very credible sources in the administration that the Russians are beginning to meddle in the 2018 election. However, roughly 2.5 weeks ago, the administration declined to pursue those sanctions, saying they felt the threat was good enough. Now, and please understand this is not a dig at your age, but you are an elder statesman, certainly the most senior member of the Wisconsin delegation. And given the committees that you sit on in the House, I guess I'm asking personally, what are you doing to ensure that these sanctions that passed in an overwhelming bipartisan manner
First of all, the thing is that we do oversight on that. Again, the Constitution, gives the president almost exclusive power over foreign policy, and presidents, basically since George Washington have told Congress to buzz off when they try to conduct foreign policy. The law is there. The president, if he chooses to implement it, can do so. If he doesn't do so, then he's the one that is going to have to answer that. We cannot force him to do something. We can.
enforce
Okay. Thank you.
Finish with the gentleman. Finish with the gentleman.
I said right at the beginning that if I was interrupted, I would stop it. He interrupted me several times, so I'm just going to move on.
My question is about opiates, which is not a new problem. It's been hanging around in the cities for more than 30 years. My daughter is a chronic pain patient. Her back was broken in a domestic abuse case, and the 3 doctors that fixed it screwed it up. In order for her to get out of bed, she has to take a pill because she can't stand up without pain. She is one of the people who agrees that the doctors absolutely overprescribe it and don't pay attention to how much they're giving people. And a lot of people get them to sell it. But she's a person who absolutely needs it because she cannot get out of bed with it. She doesn't have the medicine because her back is in such bad shape. She can't work. She can't take care of her children. Now, the fact that they've decided to cut all the opiate medicine for everybody across the board without thinking about individual cases kind of makes me grumpy.
And you ought to be grumpy for that.
Grumpy frequently, sir.
Well, I hope not. We ought to approach things with a positive manner. Let me say that to my knowledge.
100% pain 90% of the time. It's hard to be positive.
Yeah, well, and I can understand that. My wife, had a spinal cord injury. She was in chronic pain, and still is in chronic pain, as a result of that. With respect to opiates, my understanding is the blanket thing says that instead of giving 90-day prescriptions of opiates, the doctors are limited to 30-day prescriptions of opiates. Now, if somebody needs an opiate, gets a 30-day prescription and doesn't take it all at once.
It's always only 30 days.
Yeah, it's always only 30 days and doesn't take all the pills at one time in the first week because they're hooked on them and overdoses, and then doesn't have any for the next 3 weeks. We gotta get at that. But I think that, if your daughter takes the pills as prescribed, she'll get a 30-day pill. She gets a refill or a new prescription, from the doctor. She should not be in any problem on that. What I would ask you to do is that if she is having problems with this,
Not yet.
Not yet. Call up my district office and we'll see what we can do to help her out.
I will do that. Yes, I remember we talked one day about your wife's back and my daughter's back. But I think that was when we were both younger and neither of us had a cane.
I did break my back when my house caught on fire about 40 years ago. And I have a fusion in that because that's the way those injuries were treated at the time. I still have 2 steel rods to stabilize it, so I'm the only congressman that can say I have a backbone of steel and have the x-rays to prove it on that. But, having said that, we shouldn't have blanket laws put the government between a patient and their doctor. The doctor is professionally trained. He knows what is good for his patient. There are some doctors, unfortunately, who have abused the power that they have, and we've seen a tragedy at the VA hospital in Toma, where people were killed because the, quote, Candyman doctor was overprescribing, and we just want to make sure that the patients who do get the opiates, take them as prescribed, and are overseen by their doctors, rather than simply writing the prescription and, letting the patient go by themselves, because that's the way tragedy does happen. So, there are rules, there are exceptions to the rule, but we ought to have the primary focus of any rule is to not get between the doctor and the patient. And that puts more responsibility on the doctor, in my opinion, than on the patient. Because if the patient is abusing the prescription, then the doctor ought to know about it and take whatever corrective action the doctor believes is necessary.
You got a hard job, and I see you doing it with a lot of commitment. I'm concerned about climate change, and I was happy to see that in the recent tax reform bill and in the spending bill that just came out that the credits for wind and solar were preserved, also for geothermal, so thank you for being part of that. And I just wanted to hear what you have to say about what more can be done to promote renewables. I think that there's a tremendous opportunity here, that the prices of both wind and solar are dropping a lot. There's potential for new technology in nuclear as well, which is also a carbon-free technology. I'm wondering what the government can do to speed this along and promote these things.
Well, the answer to that is research, because in Europe, which has had cap and trade, it hasn't worked, and their emissions have gone up, whereas we have used research and market forces, and our emissions have gone down on that. And if you have something like cap and trade, you don't reduce total emissions. You end up spreading them out from high emission areas to low emission areas. But, there isn't a way that a country or a state or a city, can keep the emissions within their boundaries. The atmosphere doesn't work that way. So, I've always been a supporter of tax credits. I have always been a supporter of adequate research, particularly high-risk basic research by the Department of Energy and other agencies. I am not for throwing taxpayer money into applied research, because applied research is usually the commercialization of successful basic research. The basic research is frequently too risky for the private sector to prudently invest their money in, so let the government take care of that. They end up underwriting the failures, because usually in research there are more failures than successes, and it's a process of elimination. But when agencies like the National Science Foundation and the Department of Energy end up finding out something that works, then let the private sector commercialize it and go and sell it. Now, the second point I want to make, is that we have to be very aggressive in protecting the intellectual property rights of American inventors. The Chinese and the Indians are the two worst offenders of pirating American intellectual property rights. And what they do is they don't put any of their money into research and development. They go and pirate that has been paid for by people in other countries or the governments of other countries. And then they use their manufacturing capability that pays slave labor wages to go out and undersell, practically everything that we attempt to do. And this is one of the disputes that we are having on trade with China on solar panels. Because, they've used everybody else's research to make their own solar panels. There has been a government subsidy in exporting below-cost solar panels, and that has been a violation of trade laws, ever since the end of the Second World War. So, I do think the president has done the right thing, because that is one way that we can cut down on other countries benefiting from pirating our inventors' intellectual property rights. Is it Dan Schalfa?
Actually, Don Schaefer.
Don Schaefer.
My handwriting is bad.
Sorry about that, yeah.
Congressman, thanks for coming to these meetings. On the issue of global warming, would you say where you stand from, on one hand, total hoax to very serious issue?
In the middle.
In the middle. So you would say it may be occurring. Do you think it's man-made, or it doesn't might not exist?
Well, there is a scientific consensus, which I accept, that it's man-made. There is no scientific consensus whatsoever on how much of the cause of climate change is man-made. I'm here to tell you that it is not 0% and it's not 100%. But in terms of what our response is, I look at a couple of things. One is does an unequal application of whatever international agreement there is disadvantage the United States? And that's why both Kyoto and Paris are flawed, in my opinion. Secondly, are there proper credits that are given to countries that do a vigorous job of reforestation? Because that's the way you can naturally, sop up greenhouse gases, and it's necessary for growth. That's kind of basic biology. And the two countries in the world that aggressively reforest are the United States and Canada. You see very little of that in Europe. You see none of that in Japan. And, the climate in places like Australia is not very conducive over most of the country where you can plant forests and have rainforests. And along with that, we ought to stop the massive cutting down of rainforests in places like Brazil. The third thing, is that I think anything that is done either by us unilaterally or on a multilateral and international basis is something that has to be fair to the United States and something that will work, rather than something that looks real good on a bumper sticker or on the 30-second ad on TV or things like that. And unfortunately, where I think this whole debate went off on the wrong track was back in 1995 when the UN had one of these conferences of the parties in Berlin. And at that time, the American negotiator was a former United States Senator from Colorado named Tim Wirth. And he went along with basically giving the third world, a complete get-out-of-jail-free card, and they could continue increasing their emissions, at will. And China and India have been two of the worst offenders in that. And then for reasons that were completely extraneous to the whole issue, they gave the European Union, a lower greenhouse gas emission reduction goal than they gave to other countries like the US, Japan, and Canada, and Australia. And that wasn't very fair, at all. And it was basically due to the fact that The Rio Treaty uses the baseline as 1990. This was in 1995. Communism collapsed after 1990. You know, and all of those Stalinist era factories in the East Germany and the former communist bloc, you know, ended up being shut down because they were dangerous. They belched emissions, you know, right and left, and they were uneconomical. So, you know, after the communist governments left and there were democratic governments that were, you know, elected in the former Soviet satellite countries, the bad plants ended up being closed down. So they had a lower baseline to begin with, you know, because of something that happened on the geopolitical stage, you know, meaning the communists, you know, no longer protected their belching plants on this. So, you know, it's a complicated issue, you know, and unfortunately, particularly as a result of the agreement that was made in Berlin, you had countries like China, which arguably could have been a third world country then but isn't now, and India, which falls kind of in the same area, you know, on that, taking advantage of what has happened, and they have been singularly resistant to having any type of caps being put on their growth in the near and medium term. And one of my objections to the Paris Accord is that we have to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions from 28 to 26% from 2005, whereas China does not even have to slow down their increase in 2030. That's not fair to us. So you've got to have something that's uniform across the globe. So you can't have countries like China and India, you know, basically ignore that, and they emit more greenhouse gases now than we do.
So, another question. Do you accept most scientists' prediction that there's going to be a rise in sea level of between 4 and 5 feet? I think it's
No.
by 2050. You don't think
No, no. And, you know, some of the same scientists back in the late 70s were saying we were going into a new ice age.
Oh, we're like 40, almost 50 years ago.
Yeah, but it was the same scientist. Yeah, it was a NASA scientist, yeah.
In general, you would say there's probably not going to be, you don't believe there's going to be severe consequences of
Well, a rise of 4 to 5 feet in sea level, no, I don't believe that. I think that's scare tactics.
They claim that's a conservative estimate, actually.
I think that's scare tactics.
Thank you, sir.
People would have thought 50 inches of rain in 2 days was scare tactics too until that happened in Europe.
Dr. Cohen,
just
you
have to
will
point
be
that out.
recognized in due course.
Thank you.
I'm going to get back to what the gentleman before said about elections. Russia, a hostile foreign government, is aimed to weaken our democracy and sow discord in our country, will try to interfere again in the 2018 elections. But because of no presidential leadership and counterproductive action in Congress, however, our election infrastructure is still very vulnerable. Some evidence of this is some states and local governments still don't use paper ballots. In 2016, as you said, the hackers tried to penetrate at least 21 states. Well, they got into the state of Illinois, voter registration rolls. They were there for a few weeks downloading data. They were downloading data from the state of Illinois' voting system until they were caught. And then last year, there's a Russian-affiliated hacking group called Fancy Bear. Well, Fancy Bear set up a false website mimicking the U.S. Senate's website. They were there and purportedly to get logins and passwords to later release documents. To protect our nation, the Commander-in-Chief should lead an interagency effort to shore our voting systems, combat disinformation, and stop foreign actors from clandestinely influencing American decision-making. But he's doing none of this. This is a dereliction of duty, Congressman. He should our president, and he should really take a step up to the plate and do his job. He calls any mention of interference a hoax, which leads some people to believe that these threats are false, making our democracy more susceptible. Now, as the gentleman said, he's now implementing the new sanctions meant to punish Russia for election interference. Now, sir, I understand that you were in the legislative branch, and I understand that usually the president has the authority to run foreign policy. But in this case, considering what the Russians did to our democracy, and considering what they're doing to our democracy now, I mean, they're still doing influence measures right now. They need to be punished. We need to send a message that isn't acceptable. And so that's why I think the Congress should do its diligence, should do its oversight, enact its oversight responsibility, and say, hey, President, you need to do this. And then one more thing, I'll let you. Similarly, in the Congress, other than the Senate Intelligence Committee, the other Republican-led committees aren't going after those that attacked our democracy. They're going after the patriotic Americans and federal law enforcement and investigating these attacks and trying to stop future intrusion and deliberately confusing and misleading the public.
Please let him finish.
With false narratives that recklessly and needlessly expose classified intelligence information. And incidentally, Russian bots, believe it or not, Russian bots puts the quote-unquote release the memo hashtag because they wanted to compromise our intelligence gathering methods. And so, with all due respect, Congressman, how can people in the House, especially like Paul Ryan, Devin Nunes, and those people, defend themselves when they risk our national security by compromising our national intelligence resources? And how can they not hold the president to be account for his failure to implement new sanctions?
Well, first of all, it's up, as I said, it's up to the president to make that decision. Sanctions would not, excuse me, let me finish. I can say that unilateral sanctions by the United States will not be effective unless Europe imposes the same sanctions, because the Russians will simply trade with Europe rather than trading with the United States. This has got. May I answer this question, please, without interruption? This is the second time I've said this in answer to this question. I would hope that I would be able to answer the question and we can continue with the meeting. Secondly, under Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution, elections are run by the states. Now, I personally favor having some kind of a paper trail if people vote electronically. And I fought for that when I was in the legislature, a while ago on that. And I think that, there have been, enough anomalies, that have occurred, whether it was criminal in nature or probably just some kind of a programming mistake or operational mistake by the election judges that actually checked the voters in, that would end up doing that. But what I will say, is that, I agree that, we cannot compromise our sources and methods. And if the president were completely free to say what is being done to try to stop the Russians from doing this in the midterm elections, he would be telling the Russians what our technology is, and they would just simply figure out a way to go around it. They're really pretty good at doing that. Now, Russian interference in elections is nothing new. There was interference in the 2016 election in a number of ways. They interfered with the Brexit vote in England. They interfered with the elections last year that were held in France and Germany. And a lot of that was done was to disrupt the people who live in these historically democratic countries from having confidence that their elections have been fairly run and fairly represent the views of the people who voted in that election. I can say that Russian interference in American election has gone back to Soviet times. They were interfering with the elections as early as 1960. So, this is something that is new. Now, we've got to watch out for this. I can say that they did try to get into Wisconsin elections, and when the Green Party candidate demanded and paid for a statewide recount, this was something that was being looked at very closely by the then Government Accountability Board that ran elections, and by the local county clerks and the county boards of canvassers. And apparently they were not successful in doing that. But they're gonna keep on trying, and, you know, we just can't tell them, you know, what we're gonna do to stop them, because, you know, the geeks in Moscow, you know, will be able to, or wherever, you know, will be able to come up with whatever. But the bottom line, you know, is not to change the outcome of the election. You know, they got into Illinois. Well, Clinton carried Illinois by a big margin. So if they were trying to help Trump out, that was not the place to do it. But you know, the thing is that, you know, they tried here. We know what stopped them. That is being told to elections officials in other states. But the bottom line is that they want to destroy the confidence of the voters that the election was fairly run and that there was a fair outcome when the votes have been tallied and added up.
Well, a couple things. The sanctions. The reason why the Europeans aren't enough, we already have sanctions for annexing Crimea. And if I'm not mistaken, the European countries participated in those sanctions. So,
yeah, and the Russians are still there and in eastern Ukraine.
Absolutely. So I don't think that's a reason for Trump to not sign the law. Not Trump. I don't think that's a reason for Trump not to follow through on the law that he signed. Well, he, you know, or veto-proof majority last year. So I don't think that's a reason for, in any case, for us to actually implement those sanctions.
Well, you know, it would be up to him to explain why he didn't do that. You know, in Congress, we did our job. Give us a little credit what credit is due, okay?
Well, sir, then why? Well, be that as it may. And then the other issue is about the classified intelligence. See, what the Republicans did a week and a half ago is what you're saying about not giving away secrets. That's what they did. By listing the dates of when Carter Page was surveilled, the man in question in that memo, I believe strongly that Paul Ryan should have stepped in and said, no, we know that this memo, it wasn't redacted. In other words, there's information in that is top secret, and then the memo was not redacted. Now, I believe that's very irresponsible for them to do that.
Well, you know, it was sent to the president. You know, the president could have had the FBI and the intelligence community redact any of the material in the Nunes memorandum. They chose not to do that. And again, you know, the exact timing, you know, of the Carter Page surveillance and the relationship with Fusion GPS, that was in the public press since about last October. Now, just a minute, you know, Senator Grassley sent a memo up to the FBI. Referring Christopher Steele to the Department of Justice for criminal prosecution. I have it here with me. It ended up being heavily redacted. You know, I'm just showing this here, and all the things that are blacked out, you know, are the redactions in that. And only after it was redacted, you know, was it released. So, you know, this is a Republican memo that did not emanate from the Intelligence Committee, but ended up, you know, what needed to be redacted, you know, according to the FBI and the intelligence community, ended up, you know, being redacted on this. Now, you know, I don't know what was objectionable, you know, in the Schiff memo that the president refused to declassify last weekend. I haven't read it, you know, and I don't read those kinds of things, you know, simply because if I do that, you know, I can't comment on it in public. And, you know, a lot of the stuff that is in those memos ending up being released to the press before they are declassified anyhow. But, you know, we shouldn't let in the public debate, you know, what our sources and methods of analyzing intelligence, or who the sources and methods were. And the Nunes memo that I read after it was declassified had none of that in it. It talked about a timeline, but a lot of that was, you know, already in the public press. And if it's in the public press, there's no need to keep it classified.
But the surveillance warrant was not in the public press. That's the point.
Well,
the surveillance warrant was given the first time and then issued twice. And that's what they were talking about.
But
they were aware when it began, sir.
Yeah.
But they weren't aware of what done. And I'm glad that this particular document did redact. But the point is that they would tell the other one it was not.
But what was not redacted is, Senators Grassley and Lindsey Graham, have seen the applications for the surveillance warrant. And that's the key thing, because that's what is,
On page
excuse me?
Sorry, just trying to clarify, just clarifying.
Yeah, I've read this memo. The thing is that what they did is, they said that all of the applications for the surveillance warrants to the FISA court were based on the fact that, they thought that Fusion GPS and Christopher Steele was credible. Now, before the inauguration, then FBI Director Comey went to the president-elect and said that what is in the dossier that is in question was salacious and unverified. Which means that they didn't think that what Christopher Steele doing was on the up and up. After that meeting, then Rod Rosenstein, where the meeting where Trump was told it was salacious and not verified, then Rod Rosenstein signed another application to the FISA court, saying the same thing that was said before this information was given to President-elect Trump by then FBI Director Comey. That's where the disconnect occurs, and I think we need an answer to that. Now, I think that the application for the warrant should be declassified, and everybody ought to see that, to see if what is stated in this memo is true. But, the fact is that if it was something that divulged sources and methods, the big black line would have been put through it by the FBI, just like it did with a lot of the other things that were in this memo.
Well, what you're saying about being salacious, that was taken out of context, and the Democrats in that committee dispute that. Furthermore,
well, then why did Comey tell it to the president-elect?
Well,
it was taken out of context. That's the issue.
Rod Rosenstein, as the Deputy Attorney General, he would only renew that warrant if there was no information, and that's the way FISA warrants work.
I know, I've been trying to revise the FISA Act for years.
And getting back to Christopher Steele, let's get back to the big picture. You had Christopher Steele, he was aware of just suspicious contacts between Russia and Donald Trump. And he saw that Russia had hacked our election, hacked the emails and released those. And he did the right thing. He said, hey, I'm aware of this, and he passed it on to the FBI so that we can protect our democracy.
Well, if he did the right thing, sir, then why has the chairman and vice chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee sent this document all over to the Justice Department that says, accordingly, we are referring Christopher Steele to the Department of Justice for investigation of potential violations of 18 United States Code 1001?
Sir, my response to that, the reason is, I believe, they're trying to obstruct. They're trying to protect Trump, and they are trying to. The reason why they are afraid that
Hey, one more interruption like this, and the meeting will be adjourned. Cool it. We'll keep on the
please don't. We don't want this to be adjourned. Please don't.
Answer the question.
Thank you. Okay. So, I respect Lindsey Graham. I respect Chuck Grassley. But what they did was irresponsible, in my opinion, because they're trying to obstruct the investigation. That's what they're trying to do. That was the reason for that. And I think if you compare Christopher Steele to people like Jared Kushner, Paul Manafort, and Don Jr., who didn't tell the FBI about what was happening, that was what they should have done.
Well,
and I'll leave it at that.
Well, I will just. This is the last time I'm going to have to say this. Is that we're supposed to disagree without being disagreeable. This is not a cheering section. I have adjourned meetings in the past because of the interruptions and the cheering that is going on. I will not hesitate to do so again. and this is going to be the last and final warning. If it happens again, the meeting will be adjourned. Now, to respond to what you were saying, is that if you think that this type of a memo, referring under provisions of law somebody for criminal prosecution is obstruction of justice, then there is no way that the Congress can do any kind of oversight over the Justice Department, without being accused of obstruction of justice. And I want everybody to think about that, because one of the checks and balances that the framers put in the Constitution was oversight, and they gave Congress the oversight role over the executive branch. Now, if you want us to do oversight, then memorandums that were sent to the Justice Department saying that these senators who are on the Judiciary Committee believe that there should be an investigation into anybody for potential violations of the criminal laws of the United States is pure and simple good oversight. And you just think of what the consequences would be if Congress were denuded from doing oversight. We ought to do more of it rather than less.
My question is this: the Republican Party went and spent $1.5 trillion on this wonderful tax cut that's going to benefit, as far as I'm concerned, basically not me, not anybody who has, and nobody in this room unless you're over $300 million. And I see this go along, and now I hear, oh, we have this deficit. And every time the Republicans get in to spend money, they spend money, and then they want the Democrats to bail them out and get rid of the deficit. Both Clinton and Obama worked on getting down the deficit. And now it's up, and what are they going to come after? They're coming after Social Security and Medicare, because we got to cut those entitlements, because they're the things that are destroying the country. And you explained to me how you can go and give this much money away and expect the economy to go and pick it up because you're going to make the economy better. Look at the stock market jumping up and down. You're going to invest in that? How can this $1.5 trillion ever be recovered?
The answer to that question is simple: through economic growth. Meeting's adjourned.
That's what I just said to you about it. There is no economic growth.
Grow up. You can't take people who disagree with you.
Part of the spending bill, helping close the door. Thank you very much. That'll help my wife. Thank you.